so beautiful to be here. I really enjoyed like all the interactions and every little bit of it that I've peeked into. It's amazing to see this kind of movement growing here. And yeah, so I mean, I talked the other day about my path a little bit. I wrote a book called Breaking Open the Head that was on psychedelic shamanism. And in a way, like my whole life quest since then is, partially being to sort of understand the full import, the magnitude of the psychedelic experience and shamanism, the shamanic experience, and how that applies to our human world and our potential, as a species, in a sense. And, over the last years, I became more and more fascinated, I guess, by the ecological crisis as something that, we all know is looming, and it's something that we need to sort of turn our attention to as a species. And so this is going to be the negative and demoralizing part of my conversation, but I'm going to keep it relatively short, and then we'll move on. I don't know how many people here know how dire and severe the crisis is from a scientific perspective. Like, how many people here know how many species go extinct every day according to like scientist estimates? So I think it's like 150 to 200, and they estimate about 8 million species on the planet in total. So if you do the math, that means in 100 to 150 years, there's no species left on Earth, right? So that's what's happening right now. A lot of deforestation. The oceans, do people know how much more acidic the oceans are than they were? Previously, they're 30% more acidic than they were 40 years ago. And that's because they're absorbing a large amount of the CO2 that we emit. We emit like 1 million tons an hour or something like that. And the problem is that the oceans at a certain point reach a maximum saturation where they can't really hold that CO2, so then that leads to a more accelerated warming cycle. So the predictions from a lot of mainstream scientists now, if we keep going as we're going, would be a temperature rise from 3.5 degrees to 5 degrees or 6 degrees Celsius temperature rise by 2100, which is 85 years from now. But those may actually be conservative because they now recognize there's a lot more feedback loops in the system that could get engaged. The most dangerous one being, do people know about the methane under the Arctic? Who knows about the methane, the frozen methane under the Arctic and the oceans? So there's hundreds of gigatons of methane that is like 20 or 30 times more potent as a heat-trapping gas than CO2. And what they've discovered in that previous mass extinction cycles, the methane erupted. The temperature warmed to a certain point, and the methane started to erupt. And the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. So we find ourselves at this very critical threshold, and we find ourselves in this world, this kind of capitalist post-industrial world that we're embedded in that has this momentum in a certain direction. And the question is whether at this time, in the next really few years, which is kind of what we have, if there's any way to arrest the momentum, to avert it, to move in another direction. And obviously, like when you think about what can change people so profoundly and so quickly, one of the tools that are most profound for doing that are psychedelics. And you see many people going through almost like a conversion experience through ayahuasca or LSD or some combination. And that certainly happened to me. The first time I did ayahuasca, well, the second time I did ayahuasca was down in the Amazon with a tribe called the Sequoia, and the experience of doing the medicine with them was very profound. And then also passing through the forest, we saw these huge tracts of the forest that had been, the oil companies had found prospects, and they created a road, and then mestizo farmers had logged it out, and so you'd lose millions of acres of forest each time they found another prospect that didn't regrow, that then becomes shrub and goes from being carbon sink to emitting carbon, obviously. So then my thinking a little bit has been about shamanism and the idea of shamanic initiation. What is the purpose of shamanic initiation, right? I mean, all around the world, like almost every culture in the world had a process of initiation before modern culture, whether it's Egypt or ancient Greece with the mysteries of Eleusis, or obviously every traditional and tribal society. I really like this idea from Joseph Chilton Pearce that shamanic initiation doesn't just have a cultural function, it may have a kind of neurophysiological function, in that as humans, we've just been here for a relatively short time as a species, and what makes us distinctly human is the neocortex, right, which is the part of our brain that allows us to think abstractly, use symbols, use language, plot, plan long distance ahead. And it may be that while the neocortex develops naturally through childhood and adolescence, it actually needs a second induced shock in late adolescence or early adulthood to reach its full functioning. So it may be that all these traditional cultures, created these initiatory kind of passages so that people would be forced to go through a vision quest, through fasting, through use of visionary plans, through walkabout, in order to break through and be able to have a series of transpersonal experiences that would give them access to the fuller range of the neocortex, and particularly shift them from having a totally ego-based identity to having had that experience of this transpersonal, this unity consciousness identity, so that they would come back to the tribe and the community and be able to then think, for the whole in a way, comprehensively, because everybody had to work together so closely in those groups. And since modern society got rid of initiation practices like that, in a way the people in our world are trapped in a kind of a lower form of ego identity. They're unable to break through. They're kind of like, instead of adults, they're kind of like kidults, and then we've created a sort of industrial corporate media entertainment complex, which is basically a way of controlling people's consciousness and keeping them in this lower bandwidth. So my perspective is that this ecological crisis, as extreme as it seems and as dire, could actually be a tremendously positive thing, in that it could actually be kind of an initiatory threshold for humanity as a whole to make a leap or a transformation or a transmutation into another level of consciousness, another level of awareness. And I believe that we are already seeing the sort of signs that this is beginning to happen. And it's something that's going to be growing and evolving over the next years and decades. And I think that shift in awareness would be from kind of our current understanding, which is very fragmented, to kind of recognizing that humanity as a whole is a kind of a planetary superorganism that's in a symbiotic relationship with the ecology of the Earth as a whole system. And I think, does that make sense to people? Yeah, okay, cool. So I think as enough of us make that jump, it'll be kind of like a tipping point phenomenon where we'll begin to be able to rethink all of our social technologies, our infrastructures, our social systems from that perspective. And we would then look at how we could make a world that works for all, that works properly. So yeah, if we look at the model of physical evolution, that provides a really good model for this. In physical evolution, biological evolution, we see a shift from competition and aggression as primary forms of behavior to cooperation and symbiosis. As ecosystems mature, they naturally become more cooperative and more symbiotic. A tremendously good example of this we're all hanging around in right now is our own bodies. Right, our bodies were basically vast colonies of microorganisms that were competing in the environment for scarce resources, and during some type of planetary crisis, they were forced to work together, to join forces, and to figure out how to build more complex structures, more complex organs, like skin and eyes and everything else that we represent. So that's kind of the model of evolution is from competition and aggression to cooperation and symbiosis. And I think if we look at it from that way, so I mean, part of what I've tried to do is like step way back, and psychedelics I think are very valuable tools for this. I mean, psychedelics can be double-edged, obviously, or triple-edged. They have a lot of edges, for sure. But the positive aspect of them is they decondition you, they deprogram you from what your culture has given you. You're almost like you have this phenomenological reconnection with the nature of reality in itself. But then, because you're so deconstructed in a way, you can then grasp for all sorts of answers, that could be reptilian aliens or flat Earth society or whatever, and we lose our ability to have like discriminating wisdom, like discriminating intellect, and really try to use our intellect as best we can to judge, to weigh, to really find the balancing point between all these different extreme ideas. That's been a lot of my work, being open to the most esoteric and having had occult, psychic, paranormal, crazy experiences, recognizing all that stuff is legitimate on a very deep level, but not allowing that to sway me too much from recognizing that we also have a physical, natural, material reality that we need to address that really requires our tender care and concern right now. But so from that 1,000-mile viewpoint, we can then think a little bit differently about the evolution that's happening on the planet. We can see how rapidly humanity has evolved And we can even think about something like corporations. You know, a lot of people who are in the progressive or left or anarchist side of the world have a negative perspective on corporations. And it's true, they've been very destructive forces. They're eating their way through the planet, you know, and so on. But if you think about them differently, you know, in a way, they're the most powerful, like, kind of social organisms that humanity has created. They're able to take ideas and use like legal code, financial data, you know, infrastructure to manifest those ideas as quick, you know, incredibly quickly and incredibly powerfully. You could maybe look at corporations, if we're thinking about this idea of humanity being a planetary superorganism, you could maybe think about corporations as being the nascent organs in the collective body of humanity. If you think about like a media company, it's kind of like the perceptual mechanisms in our own heads that are taking in data, you know, translated into signals, communicating those signals through the body. If you think about like a sanitation company, it's like the liver or the kidney. An energy company is like the blood and the circulation system. You know, so corporations are actually kind of, I say, the first stage in a process of you know, the planetization of consciousness, let's say. You know, we've reached the edge of globalization, and then the next stage would be the planetization of consciousness and repurposing the media infrastructure, the corporate capacity, finding a way to reinvent and recreate, you know, but taking a permaculture approach, kind of using what we have to then bring it up to another level of capacity. Yeah, I think, you know, but obviously the problem with corporations, another way to look at them would be as artificial life forms that we have created, and we inject them into a game machinery that we call the stock market. And in that game machinery called the stock market, we give the corporations one prime directive, which is what? Make money, maximize shareholder value, make profit. So essentially, we've designed the system as a suicide system, because we've constructed these very powerful social technologies called corporations, and we said they have to maximize profit no matter what. So that's just what they seek to do, and in that sense, you can't even really just, you know, blame, you know, British Petroleum for the Gulf oil spill. I mean, you know, when they have to maximize profit, they're automatically going to, you know, behave sociopathically. They're automatically going to evade ecological, you know, restrictions, corrupt government legislation. You know, so ultimately, I believe that it's going to require kind of a system redesign. Probably along, you know, similar principles to what Buckminster Fuller talks about, kind of a shift from the inertia of the evolution that's taken us to this point to a conscious evolution, a conscious co-creative realization that we actually have the capacity to take control of spaceship Earth, you know, to operate the systems properly and to take it in the right direction. You know, similarly, we can look at our political system developed in the 18th century, right? So the political system developed at a time when horse and buggies and scooter ships were the fastest mode of communication. And so it's very limited in terms of the speed, you know, compared to the speed of change that we're now seeing on the planet. The governments are kind of ossified and obstructionist. You know, so then once again, if you look at the history of kind of media technology and its relationship to the evolution of political economic systems, there's like a direct relationship, right? Like you couldn't have had empires like Rome and Babylon without a written code of laws that gets disseminated across the whole empire. You couldn't have had you couldn't have had the modern liberal nation state with the ability to vote, representational democracy, you know, until you had the printing press and literacy and the ability for people to at least be that engaged they could get information and contribute. You know, so the possibility is that the internet points towards like a next level of political economic system. And I think we see kind of foreshadowings of this even in things like Bitcoin or a number of tools that are being developed so that people can make decisions directly through, you know, ongoing systems. Like one is called Democracy OS. That's an interesting tool. Lumio.org, L-O-O-M-I-O, is another way that groups can make decisions together. Like in a way that would be the next threshold where we figure out how we can rethink the code of our social, political, and economic systems so that they work for the benefit of everybody on the planet. Because the goal, I think, from following, you know, Buckminster Fuller's idea in his books like Utopia or Oblivion, would be to make a world system that, you know, brings everybody up to a basic, you know, decent way of life by giving everybody enough subsidization so that they can eat, they can live, they can have free access to education. Like, you know, Bucky recognized in the 60s that was totally within our grasp. It's just the inertia of our political system and the ideologies which are still kind of trapping people that have made this impossible. Another way I like to look at it is from this thinker Peter Russell. And he talks about how if we look at these successive revolutions in human conscious society, they've been happening exponentially faster. So we had 5,000 years was the agricultural revolution. Then you had the industrial revolution, which has been about 500 years. Now we've had the information revolution, the information age, which has been about 50 years. And each of these revolutions builds on the past one, right? So you couldn't have had industry without the surplus from agriculture. You couldn't have had the information age gadgets without the manufacturing infrastructure that allowed everybody to get the smartphones and yada yada. So Peter Russell's idea is that we're on the cusp of another evolutionary jump, which would be from the information age to what he talks about as the wisdom age. And what that would essentially mean would be, kind of what I'm saying. Like we've got the infrastructure in place now. We have the media. We have the communication. The whole planet can speak to each other. Everybody around the world. How can we then utilize this to make this conscious evolution in our practices? So I see the ecological pressure that we're under as a profound opportunity for an awakening and transformation. And although it looks difficult, if we were in the next few years to make a collective shift in this direction, we would probably be able to work miracles. So for instance, we know that converting from monocultural agriculture, industrial agriculture to no-till agriculture, ecological, organic agriculture would sequester something about 30% of the CO2 that people are now putting into the air. There are all sorts of sustainable technologies like biochar, rainwater harvesting systems, just permaculture design principles, and we could, in a sense, use the communication system and the manufacturing infrastructure to get these types of tools and the types of trainings out to the human population. I find something really amazing right now in this new Pope, Pope Francis, who just issued this encyclical, Care for Our Common Home, which is actually a profound systemic ecological kind of manifesto, where he's noting that we've gone too far in the direction of hyper-individuality and materialism, technocracy, and that we need to have a call out for shared sacrifice. I never thought that I would agree so much with the Pope, being a psychedelic anarchist, but it turns out that opposites meet at some strange point in the future. So then the big question would be, how do we do this? I've been working on that a lot, and that's kind of been my sort of my effort right now. I think media and communication is a huge piece of it. The media functions as a consciousness control system. I very much love what Russell has been doing with the truths, which has been really just taking it on his own to get an alternative, worldview, solutions-based, critical, out to humanity. I think that a big issue and something we're really going to have to work on is how do we deal with the sociopaths who are kind of running our system. And that is something where we really have to use masterfully like anthropology and psychology, because I don't think it's about casting those people out either. And actually, if you look at traditional cultures, they had different initiation paths. In Egypt, they would have temples of Horus, and then they would have temples of Set. Or in Mesoamerica, they have temples of Quetzalcoatl and temples of Tezcatlipoca, who was like the dark sorcerer, the jaguar, the smoking mirror. And so they found a way to honor that sociopathic sorcery principle. So in a way, it's almost like we have to think, about what kind of reward structure do we create that allows those people an opportunity to thrive without them being a destructive burden, on the planetary ecology. So there's a few areas where we need to do some serious thinking work. The future of value exchange. What the money system could evolve into. Are there other ways that people could exchange money? That's something I've explored in a few books. I edited a book called Sacred Economics by Charles Eisenstein, which is available free online, and a book called What Comes After Money, which was an anthology, and it's too much to go into right now. And then we also see, I'm a huge fan of Burning Man, and there we see a place where they've created a different reward system. And so I see people that I would consider kind of corporate sociopaths, go to Burning Man, and within 3 days they're wearing a pink tutu and they're cleaning up a moop everywhere. And it's because that's how you get rewarded in that structure. I think people change almost instantly without thought when the reward structure around them shifts, what they're getting rewarded for, praised for, in a sense. One last idea before we go into a little bit of a Q&A. I hope did this make sense to you guys? Yeah. Awesome. Okay, cool. One of my pet theories is that it might be that the ecological crisis, and we've known about it for a long time. The Club of Rome in the early 70s issued this whole report that by 2050 the whole thing would collapse without a change in direction and a change in motivation and so on. So we've known about it for a while, but we haven't been able to shift. So I think, as I said, I think subconsciously, humanity has self-willed this crisis to bring about our own transmutation, our own metamorphosis. And one area that I think is quite possibly part of that is the area of our latent psychic abilities, our latent psychic capacities. I mean, having had many psychic experiences myself, a way of thinking about it would be, a little bit like the origin of electricity, right? In the 18th century, Benjamin Franklin got zapped. They were like, okay, there's this stuff, electricity. How do we use it? And it actually took generations of experiment to figure out how you could capture it, how you could transmit it, how you could store it, and so on. So maybe we're at the same threshold with psi phenomena or psychic energy. And maybe one way that we will be holding the planet's ecology together will be global, planetary psychic working in the forms of meditation, exercises, focusing exercises, devotional exercises. And once again, if anything, I think this ecological crisis is going to be that point where humanity comes together as one and discovers its inherent unity. So anyway, so those are some of my thoughts. Thank you so much for listening.